Want to start a podcast, or are you already a podcast host? What would you say if I told you that you can get paid up to $31 per guest you interview, and I can help you book those guests? If you want to start making more money with your podcast right now and interview great guests who your listeners will love, it's not too good to be true. It's Podmatch. If you use my Podmatch link in the show notes right now, Podmatch will pay you up to $31 per interview. Yes, up to $31 per interview. I did not stutter. If you want to make more money from your podcast while expanding your reach and getting more listeners, simply click our Podmatch link in the show notes right now to check out this really cool opportunity. Welcome back to the Podgasm Marketing Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Fleming, and you've heard me say this before, and I'm going to say it yet again. Your listeners are on a battlefield, and they're trying to accomplish a mission. And when you understand how a battlefield works, you'll understand how to make your podcast work by helping your listeners win. In the last episode, we talked about how to identify and speak to the propaganda your listeners face and holds them back so you can speak to them on a deeper heart level and they'll want to follow your show more. And in this episode, I'm going to show you the next step in this 8-step communication framework process. In this episode, I'm going to teach you how to be your listeners' trusted ally they come to for help. But before I do that, be sure to grab the free Speak Your Listeners Language PDF. It's a simple 3-page PDF that's going to show you 7 super simple keys to easily crafting a powerful brand message for your podcast that will make your podcast more appealing to more of the right people so your show will grow. So if you want more people to notice your podcast more often and subscribe to it, go grab it right now. It's free. Just click the link in the show notes that says Speak Your Listeners Language right now. So if you want more subscribers, listeners, and downloads of your podcast, people need to see you as a trusted ally they can come to who can help them. But if you're frustrated with all the effort you put into your podcast and you aren't getting the results you want, a big reason is likely because your listeners don't see you as the trusted ally who can help them win and avoid what they don't want and get what they do want. So in this episode, again, I'm going to teach you 2 very simple but powerful things you need to do so your podcast can gain a larger and more loyal following. And let me ask you this really quick, fellow podcaster. Are you looking for an easy way to record your podcast episodes in world-class high quality, edit them in a flash, and make them live without all the technical headaches and confusion? If so, then you're in luck. Riverside FM is the premier podcast recording software that allows you to produce the same high-quality podcasts as other world-famous podcasters your listeners are already enjoying. Look, level up your podcast right now, even if you're brand new, you're not a techie, maybe you don't have a lot of time, so you can attract more listeners to your podcast consistently. This thing has AI software built into it that can cut clips from your podcast and do in 5 seconds what it would take you 5 hours to do, so you can share those to social media and get more exposure and grow your following. So look, simply click the Riverside FM link in the show notes to grow your podcast to the next level, starting right now. Here's how you establish what I'm talking about. 2 simple keys. Here's how you become the trusted go-to ally for your podcast listeners. It's just 2 very simple steps. This is easy, so pay attention. Connection and credibility. 2 words, connection and credibility. When your podcast brand messaging addresses these 2 things in the context of the battles and desires your listeners have, people will listen to you more. Connection answers this question, and you need to answer these 2 questions in the mind of your listeners. The first one, this connection, it answers this question. Does this podcaster understand my struggle and where I am? In other words, do you know what it's like to be them, and do they know that? Do they feel empathy from you? And then secondly, the credibility piece answers this question. Why should I listen to this podcaster's advice? In other words, how do I know they're legit? Why should I listen to you? You say and list a few things. This is what you do. You say and you list a few things for each of these 2 categories in your marketing messaging. So for example, with the connection piece, here's one way it might look. There's a lot of ways you can say this, but here's one way you might say it. I know what it's like to struggle with blah, 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 whatever it is that they struggle with that you help them overcome. And then the credibility piece, you could say something like this. I started out in this 10 years ago and I dealt with the same thing you are, but now I have blah, 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 whatever desired outcome that they want that you have. In other words, you're telling them why they need to listen to you because you've done what they're trying to do. It's the credibility piece. you don't want to brag too hard on this because you don't want to come off like you're bragging about yourself, but they need to know that you have enough credibility that you can get them an outcome they want. So you have to sprinkle it in there a little bit. So here are a couple examples of this key point in action. The same two examples I've been using, me speaking to the military in my marketing messaging to them, and this podcast. So speaking to the military on marriage, I would say something like this. This is what I used to say when I was on the phone, or I was talking to them, emailing them, trying to get booked to speak. It's the same thing as doing this on your podcast. It's the same thing. I would say something like, I know what it's like to come home from war and struggle in my marriage. See, a little empathy there, because there are people, our service members, who came home from war struggling in their marriages. I know what it's like to come home from war and struggle in my marriage, because I did too after coming home from Afghanistan severely injured. But now my wife and I have been happily married for almost 19 years. So here's what I did there. I know what it's like to come home from war and struggle in my marriage. Connection, the empathy piece, now the credibility piece. Why should any of them listen to me? How do I know what that's like? Because I struggled with that too. After coming home from the war in Afghanistan severely injured. That's the credibility piece. And now I have one more sentence that kind of elaborates on that credibility. But now my wife and I have been happily married for almost 19 years. Do you see how that works? When you pair the connection and the credibility piece, it's a very powerful statement. It's only a sentence or two. Now, what about this podcast? Let's say I know what it's like to have a message that matters, but it feels like nobody's listening and it isn't going anywhere. That's a lot of podcasters, and that's what this podcast actually seeks to change. So there, you see the empathy piece. I know what it's like to have a message that matters, but it feels like nobody's listening and it isn't going anywhere. Now for the credibility piece. But once I learned to say what I do in a clear, compelling way that my listeners understood, my podcast grew by 300% in the first 12 months. All right, so that's an example. The empathy. I know what it's like to struggle with whatever they're dealing with. But once I learned how to do this thing, insert results that you've gotten that you can help them get to. So again, connection, credibility, pair those things together. So I want you to write down why you're just like your listeners and understand their struggles, the connection. Now, if you can't write it down, if you're in the car, maybe just voice text it to yourself or something like that. But think about how can you have I know what it's like to struggle with whatever statement. Talk about that, why you understand their struggles. And then also write down and record why they should trust you and listen to you, the credibility piece. A little bit of what you've done that they'll know that you know what you're talking about and they can trust your advice. Again, when you establish genuine connection and credibility with your listeners, you'll become their trusted ally and they will come back and listen to your podcast over and over and over and over again, as long as they're still on that journey that you're helping them with. If you know any other podcasters that this episode can help, please do them a favor and share it with them. Just click that share button and share it with them real quick. It only takes about 3 seconds. It'll help them and it will help me help them in the same way I'm trying to help you. Do you struggle to write compelling and effective brand messaging that gets your podcast noticed? Do you want more people to listen to your podcast, but you struggle to talk about it in a way that grabs their attention and keeps it? If your podcast marketing messaging is not up to par, you are losing listeners. But maybe you don't know anything about copywriting and writing marketing messaging and such. Fortunately for you, I've been doing it for over 17 years. Do you want me to write your podcast marketing messaging for you in a clear, powerful, and compelling way that grabs your ideal listener's attention and makes them want to listen to your podcast over and over again? Each month I take on a small, limited number of clients and rewrite their podcast marketing messaging for them. Yes, I do all the hard work for you, and you just get to enjoy the benefits of it without any of the headaches when I'm done. If you want me to craft clear, distinct, and compelling marketing messaging that grows your podcast for you so you can attract more listeners consistently, send me an email right now at podgasmshow@gmail.com. There's a link in the show notes. And put the word consult in the subject line to check my availability.